February 18, 2001. On this day, the Intimidator, Dale Earnhardt Senior, passed away during the Daytona 500's last lap. His untimely passing caused a void in American society as well as NASCAR. It was over. That seemed too sudden for a man so resilient. His private garage was the only location that was spared the spotlight in the years that followed. It was a secret vault of stories that was hidden away and largely unknown to the general population. When they eventually opened it, everyone was horrified by what they discovered in Dale Earnhardt's garage following his passing. Let's get right to the point. The legacy Dale Earnhardt Senior left behind. During his lengthy and illustrious NASCAR career, Dale Earnhardt Senior established himself as one of the sport's most prosperous and significant drivers. He won 76 Cup Series races between his first Winston Cup victory in 1979 at the Southeastern 500 in Bristol and his last victory in 2000 at the Winston 500 in Talladega. However, he was defined by how he won, not just by his victories. Unapologetically aggressive, he was a formidable presence on any track thanks to his daring drafting, forceful bumping, and psychological dominance. He tied the all-time record held by Richard Petty at the time with his 7 Winston Cup victories in 1980, 1986, 1987, 1990, 1991, 1993, and 1994. Jimmy Johnson later tied this mark, but it was never surpassed. Earnhardt was particularly dominating at Daytona, winning the Twin 125s a record 12 times and the Busch Clash 6 times. However, he failed to win the Daytona 500 until 1998, when his heartfelt triumph ended a 20-year drought, and even the opposing pit crews rejoiced. But his impact extended well beyond the figures. Earnhardt was the quintessential blue-collar hero, a man who raced with an ethos that resonated with the ideals and hardships of regular Americans, rather than just for trophies. Dale left school in the 9th grade after being born in 1951 to Ralph Earnhardt, a well-liked but underfunded short-track driver, and supported his early racing endeavors with a variety of odd jobs. His origin narrative, Southern heritage, and straightforward manner made him relatable, particularly to supporters from the working class and rural areas. He was a man who forged his own path and didn't look for favor. He raced with grit and without apologies. His number 3 black Chevrolet came to represent both respect and fear, and he frequently sported a frown behind his signature mustache and black sunglasses. Although Earnhardt's public persona as the Intimidator was meticulously constructed, it was also incredibly genuine. Fans liked him for just that reason, while his rivals recognized him as a fierce competitor who would not think twice about making contact in the corners. He was honest, even brazen, and always true to himself. For some, he is a demigod. For others, he is an anti-hero. His expertise was appreciated even by those who disapproved of his ways. He carried that authenticity into his behavior off the track. He had strong ties to his hometown, shared hunting and fishing excursions with pals, and made time for his followers. He didn't use handlers or media consultants to enhance his public persona. In contrast to many other athletes of his day, fans received what they saw. However, what was unknown and unsaid, even by those closest to Earnhardt, may be the most fascinating aspect of his legacy. A large portion of the NASCAR community and the general public were shocked by his untimely death on the last lap of the 2001 Daytona 500, as well as by the silent empire he had established away from the spotlight. His Mooresville, North Carolina-based racing outfit, Dale Earnhardt, Incorporated or DI, had quietly become a dominant force in the sport, fielding cars and nurturing talent, including his son Dale Earnhardt. Junior safety changes in the sport were also influenced by him after his death. A basal skull fracture that Earnhardt suffered led to his death, which marked a sea change for NASCAR, which adopted new safety technologies slowly at the time. Following the disaster, NASCAR changed its emergency response procedures, installed safety barriers on courses, altered car chassis for impact resistance, and required the use of the HANS device, short for head and neck support. In this way, his passing sparked life-saving reforms that have since shielded innumerable drivers. Through tributes, films, and the ongoing appeal of his image, his presence has been maintained over time. After being out of the Cup Series for more than 10 years, the number 3 car made a comeback in 2014 under the sponsorship of Richard Childress Racing, which was piloted by Austin Dillon, Childress' grandson. The Earnhardt name was carried into the 21st century by his son Dale Jr. Despite never attempting to emulate his father's persona or style, he is quickly becoming a fan favorite in his own right. Dale Earnhardt Senior is still a mainstay in American popular culture as well as racing circles. In little communities throughout the South, garage walls still have murals of his visage. On social media, his quotations are shared. The Black 3 is still printed on window decals, caps, and t-shirts. He has gone from being an ordinary athlete to a cultural hero thanks to his life narrative, which is equal parts achievement, struggle, and sorrow. The private garage is only one aspect of his story, though. The world lost a legendary figure in motorsports when Dale Earnhardt Sr. died in 2001. Few people had ever seen his private garage in North Carolina in its entirety, but those closest to him were left with something subtly potent. Earnhardt, who has long been referred to as the Intimidator, due to his aggressive racing style and unwavering attitude, led a private life that was mostly hidden from the public eye. Thus posthumously, family members and long-standing confidants came into the garage. It was done with a blend of quiet interest and respect. They discovered more than just a place to save auto parts. It was a privately owned, carefully kept museum of memory that was close to his Mooresville, North Carolina home. It was not a showy or dazzling garage. It had a careful yet practical layout. The observer and the objects were not separated by velvet ropes or neon lights. Showmanship wasn't the point. It was, amid jackets, faded newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and framed photographs, many of which had never been published. Race cars that had been meticulously preserved sat wheel to wheel with helmets and trophies. Every object appeared to be part of a story, not just a particular moment. It was more akin to entering a silent autobiography written in tools, tires, grease, and grime, than it was to strolling around a warehouse. In the words of Earnhardt, "I left everything behind there." It was more than just a declaration of his physical departure. It was a final message buried in the items he chose to save, a coded emotional gesture. The focal point of this potent setting was a 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, the jewel in his personal collection. This Chevy had obviously been kept rather than repaired, in contrast to the immaculate, well-maintained vehicles you see at auto events. It had original upholstery. Fingerprints and faded labels were visible on the engine bay. The chrome trim on the dashboard had a patina that comes only from decades of use. This was a relic of Earnhardt's past. The vehicle brought back memories of his early years in Kannapolis, where young Dale watched and learned from his father, Ralph Earnhardt, as he worked on automobiles in the yard. The 1957 Chevy, which stood in the garage's geometric center, served as more than just a focal point. The place was a shrine. It was surrounded by pictures of Dale as a youngster, smiling through grease-stained hands, leaning on his father's cars, and sitting on toolboxes. It was obvious from the placement. The tale started at this point. The remainder of the garage was a rolling chronology of his racing career. Numerous genuine NASCAR race vehicles, all in the same condition as when they were last raced, were parked throughout. The dirt, dings, and race day wear from their last laps were still visible on these authentic bikes. Perhaps the most famous automobile in NASCAR history, the black Goodwrench Chevrolet Monte Carlo, stood silently against one wall, its matte black paint absorbing the faint light. The blue and yellow Wrangler-sponsored Chevrolet he drove during his ascent in the 1980s, as well as vintage cars from his illustrious collaboration with Richard Childress, were close by. It was uncommon to see these autos preserved, scars and all. The majority of drivers part with their race cars. They are frequently sold or reused by teams. Earnhardt, however, had clung to these particular machines, clearly realizing that each one represented a turning point that statistics alone could never properly commemorate. With all the stuff, the garage revealed a side of Earnhardt that even close colleagues never fully experienced during his lifetime. A man who preserved his history for the sake of his legacy rather than his own ego. The backstories of the souvenirs. The garage of Dale Earnhardt Senior wasn't designed with business in mind. There were no glossy displays designed for guests, no velvet ropes, and no information plaques. Rather, everything was presented with a subdued deliberateness, as if Earnhardt were communicating with things rather than words. Every car, jacket, helmet and note was put back where he had left it. The vehicles were at the center of it all, and no automobile conveyed a tale more effectively than the black three-digit Goodwrench Chevrolet Monte Carlo, which in the 1990s had come to represent excellence and fear. A number of these vehicles, each from a different season and with scars from their most recent excursions, were kept intact in the garage. Dirt still onto the fenders, cracked paint and tire marks. These weren't restorations from a showroom. Earnhardt climbed out of them, leaving them just how they were. One Monte Carlo still had the broken rear panel from the 1996 Winston 500, where he finished in 18th place with a few laps remaining, and went on to achieve one of his most spectacular triumphs at Talladega. Another had faint dirt marks from his favorite short track, Bristol Motor Speedway, where he had 9 career victories. A tribute to the time before the sleek black number 3 became renowned, the Wrangler-sponsored Pontiac Grand Prix from the mid-1980s was parked earlier in the garage. During the Wrangler years, Richard Childress used to race this blue and yellow vehicle, a time when Earnhardt was still developing his image as a fierce competitor. Despite not being as well known as the later Goodwrench entries, the Wrangler was an essential element of his early career, particularly his championship seasons in 1986 and 1987, which cemented his relationship with Childress and established what would go down as NASCAR's most illustrious driver-owner combination. Race day automobiles were not the only ones saved. The collection also includes Earnhardt's first Busch Series vehicle, a rust-colored unrepaired Oldsmobile. Although it wasn't quick or well-known, it stood for perseverance and selflessness. He once confided in a friend that he had to pray over this car before every race since he knew that any collision could be his last, both for safety reasons and because of the potential financial disaster. When he was only Ralph's boy, trying to make it in the late 1970s, he began competing at Concord Speedway and Metrolina Fairgrounds with vehicles similar to these. Helmets were scattered in a corner of the garage, roughly grouped by era. Sweat-stained fire suits accompanied the early open-faced variants with scratched visors. These belonged to a man who began racing when safety equipment was scarce and standards were harsh. His subsequent helmets, which included more sophisticated padding and aesthetically pleasing paint jobs, demonstrated both his increasing prominence within NASCAR and the organization's developing professionalism. Someone had scribbled with a silver Sharpie on one of the 1990 Coca-Cola 600 scratched visors, heated it up, and won it nevertheless. Personal belongings that may have appeared ordinary but had profound meaning were among the helmets. For instance, a worn leather duffel bag bearing fading travel permits from races in Richmond, Michigan, and Atlanta, use only in dire circumstances. A paper note scotched to a spare fire suit reads, "Spare suit." It was a grim realism that pervaded everything. It wasn't a man getting ready for guests, it was a man who dedicated his life to his work. There was a dusty shelf of trophies toward the rear of the garage. Some were shiny, while others were worn down by time. There came the iconic 1998 Harley J. Earl Daytona 500 trophy, with its recognizable winged form. However, there were also more humble, smaller prizes. A ceramic cup from a dirt track invitational, a plaque from Hickory Motor Speedway from 1975, and a thank you plate from a local school fundraiser, where he once gave a signature tire. NASCAR's data records do not contain the narrative these lesser-known trophies told. They talk to a man who never lost his grounding, no matter how high he went, and who recognized where he came from. Then came the surprising parts. His hunting weapon, a camouflage cap with DEI hand-stitched by a fan in 1996, and an autographed picture of Johnny Rutherford, are all displayed on the wall. Junior's Talladega 1990 post-race present was a set of antlers wrapped in duct tape. Earnhardt's humor, friendships, and unwavering devotion to his roots and supporters were all evident in these personal, unconventional objects. Without the now famous 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, the memorabilia narrative would not be complete. It wasn't polished like in the showroom. The paint was worn down. Leaning in made the seats squeak. However, this vehicle was unique. It stood in the center of the garage, surrounded by framed pictures of Dale Earnhardt as a child and his father, Ralph. The Chevy was a steel and chrome origin story. Dale had grown up watching his father work on cars like that in Kannapolis. Race victories were not necessary. It had won something bigger already. It kept the memories of the beginning intact. The items Dale Earnhardt kept were not homages to fame or power, despite his passion. They were shards of a purpose-driven racing existence. Every object, from a scratched visor to a crumpled trophy, was a part of a life narrative that was conveyed through metal, oil, dirt and quiet rather than words. The garage wasn't a place of worship. It was a contemplation of his motivations and the people he competed for. Many of these items are either on display at the Richard Childress Racing Museum in Welcome, North Carolina, or housed at the DEI complex in Mooresville. Others are kept secret, unaltered, as their worth cannot be determined by the general population. Wait though, that wasn't all. Strange and unusual things. Original race cars, championship trophies, and melancholy tributes to memory and legacy dominated much of the garage area, but there were also surprising, eccentric items strewn throughout that added depth and complexity to the portrait of Earnhardt's true self. A forklift parked close to the back of the garage was one of the first peculiarities that guests noticed. It's not precisely the sort of thing one would anticipate in a place with a rich history of motorsport. It wasn't just any forklift though, with traces of duct tape on the handles and a tiny number 3 sticker on the side. It was fully decked out in Winston Cup decals. Former DEI employees claimed that Earnhardt's favorite way to assist in the workplace, particularly when carrying big items or crates, was with this forklift. He insisted on being the driver. When he wasn't on the track, he frequently joked that it was the actual number 3 ride. The forklift, which was obviously still in working order and covered in faded sponsor logos, had come to represent Earnhardt's ironic sense of humor. A big weather-beaten Wrangler billboard, a relic from the early 1980s, when Earnhardt's number 3 car was sporting the denim brand's recognizable yellow and blue livery, was leaning next to it. Before Earnhardt saved it, the sign, which had previously been utilized in advertising campaigns throughout the South, had obviously been exposed to wind and sun for years. Rust twisted across the frame, the paint chipped, and the corners were torn. However, it was purposefully kept upright against the distant wall as a nostalgic memento, rather than for aesthetic reasons. This billboard marked the beginning of a significant phase in his NASCAR career, when Wrangler was one of his first major sponsors and the sport was still unpolished, localized and free of the commercialism that would come to define it. Then there were the more peculiar components that were difficult to classify. In the corner hummed an antique soda machine from the 1990s, still stocked and in working order, featuring vintage Coca-Cola and Mountain Dew cans with the NASCAR emblem. These machines were common in pit lanes and garages throughout the South at one point, and Earnhardt had retained his. A pair of worn-out dusty cowboy boots had been placed nearby on little wooden stands, resembling some kind of trophy. It was obvious that the boots had been used for years. The severs of them and used for years. They had no labels, and they weren't marked by a plaque, but their elevated, strangely reverent setting gave the impression that they had a personal significance. A cracked leather recliner, which appeared to have withstood several decades and numerous arguments, was located in the sitting area next to the rear exit. Years of hand sitting there had stained the armrests and worn down the middle of the seat. On a little wooden side table next to it were a stack of old racing magazines, a worn-out TV remote wrapped in electrical tape, and an ashtray with the number 3 emblem on it. No effort was made to tidy up this section. It appeared as though Earnhardt may have entered at any time and slumped back into that recliner to watch a western or a race replay. It was a corner that had been lived in, clearly human, flawed, and completely uncurated. These items gave Earnhardt's garage a sense of dimension, even though they didn't carry the same weight as titles or significant victories. In the midst of the equipment and recognition, they provided little bursts of humor, affection, and individuality. Above all, they stressed that this area was never intended as a public display. Inside jokes, intimate anecdotes, and modest artifacts from a life influenced by more than just the gleam of trophies and the thunder of motors abound in this refuge. Whether it was the old boots or the Winston Cup forklift, these odd objects demonstrated that Earnhardt never forgot his roots. He stayed true to his roots, working class, straightforward, and dryly humorous. Yes, he remembered his career's high peaks, but he also paid tribute to the ordinary, the sentimental, the absurd. What then become of all this? What happened to the collectibles of Dale Earnhardt Senior? The alert portion of the racing community was in startled silence following Dale Earnhardt's death at the Daytona 500 in 2001. His family and close associates, however, made a deliberate and thoughtful decision in the months and years that followed, to conserve the very places and items that told the complete complex tale of the man behind the helmet, rather than to polish his memory into something sterile and untouchable. The choice to allow public access to portions of Earnhardt's original garage and workshop complex in Mooresville, North Carolina, was crucial to this endeavor. Parts of that private world were gradually moved to carefully chosen environments: the Dale Earnhardt Tribute Center in Kannapolis, the Richard Childress Racing Museum in Welcome, and the DEI site in Mooresville, a large showroom and retail area brimming with pictures, awards, race suits, and other memorabilia documenting the careers of Dale Earnhardt Senior, his son Dale Jr., and other DEI drivers were part of the facility when it opened to the public in 1999. The 700-square-foot rotunda, which felt more like a tribute to a life lived quickly and recklessly than a corporate display, would house Earnhardt's Winston Cup trophies, Junior's honors, and instruments of the trade. The structure was lovingly referred to as the Garage Mahal. But as time went on, DEI's public-facing aspect started to wane. The showroom was only open for a few hours each day prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. With shelves of largely uncommercialized and undisturbed relics, visitors at the time referred to the experience as a sentimental time capsule. However, the public was never allowed back in when the pandemic started. The lively area that had allowed fans to get up close and personal with Earnhardt is now closed, its contents trapped behind locked doors and dim lighting. The public has been excluded, even if portions of the site are still utilized for private or engineering projects. A vast collection of Earnhardt's race vehicles and mementos are preserved at the Richard Childress Racing Museum in North Carolina, which is frequently the destination for those seeking a more intimate experience with his legacy. The museum is around 50,000 square feet in size and was first inaugurated in 2003 inside the old RCR store. After Earnhardt's death in 2001, supporters signed one of his team haulers, which is currently on display at the RCR Museum. The emotional impact of being in a space with these real machinery and unique details is something that visitors frequently comment on. The displays are thoughtfully set up, with plaques narrating the histories of each vehicle, competition, or image. The intensity and the feeling that Earnhardt's presence is still present in the rooms he previously entered, however, are what really strike a chord. There are other regional initiatives to commemorate his memory, but the RCR Museum is the largest and most official preservation of his legacy. Earnhardt's hometown of Kannapolis, North Carolina, has revolving exhibitions and local locations